Welcome to Kibbe on Liberty. We're going to do something special today, something a little bit different. We're going to talk about Iran with Senator Rand Paul. As you probably know by now, he has been approved or agreed to by President Trump to represent the United States in informal conversations with officials from Iran. Neoconservatives everywhere are going batshit crazy. That tells you that there's probably something important going on. We're going to talk to Senator Paul about what he's trying to accomplish, what an America First foreign policy is, and why we should talk to Iran before we start World War III. Sounds reasonable, sounds rational. It's part of a project here at Free the People. We're trying to get people to appreciate the fact that Congress has abdicated its war powers, that we've been at war in Afghanistan for 18 years. There are actually young men going to war in Afghanistan who weren't born when we declared that war. Think about that for a second. Think about the trillions of dollars that we're spending. And President Trump has said some very rational things about this. He says that war hurts the economy. Yes, it does. Spending trillions of dollars that you don't have instead of investing in private businesses, investing in your son's education, investing in other social problems, that hurts. But most important, and this is something that hopefully no one disputes, is people die in war. A lot of people die. A lot of young Americans, men and women who signed up to defend their country, are dying as we do these social experiments called regime change. I'm a fan of Frederick Hayek, as you probably know, and you probably need to chug right now because I'm going to quote Hayek, and that's a game here on Kibbe on Liberty. But Hayek talked about something called the fatal conceit, and he was talking about socialists that thought that they knew enough to redesign complex systems, economies, cultures from the top down. Think about the neocons and regime change. Think about the arrogance that says, if I take out that guy, suddenly all of the people of Iraq are going to embrace liberal democracy, and they're going to embrace capitalism, and there's not going to be any problems anymore. How'd that work out? How did it work out in Libya? How is it going to work out if we do regime change in Iran? Well, there's a history here. The United States has been involved in Iran literally since the 1950s. And every step we have made has created a more unstable situation, a more radicalized breeding ground for terrorists, and more enemies to the United States, to you and to me. So we're going to sit down with Rand. I think what he's doing, candidly, is heroic. His willingness to engage the president, his willingness to take on even those nasty neocons in the Trump administration, guys like John Bolton, that's something that somebody needs to do. And I'm really glad that Rand is doing it. He had a candid conversation with us. Check it out. Senator Paul, thanks for joining us. There's a lot going on in Iran. There's this chorus of voices inside the Beltway clamoring for war. But I wanted to start by reading a quote recently from President Donald Trump. And he seems pretty definitive. I'm not someone that wants to go into war because war hurts economies. War kills people, most importantly. Don't kid yourself. You do have a military-industrial complex. They do like war. I say, I want to bring our troops back home. The place went crazy. You have people here in Washington, they never want to leave, they always want to fight. I assume you agree with President Trump on that.
Sounds like something I could have said.
Yeah.
I just came from a group called Turning Point USA. It's a bunch of young kids, high school kids that are big supporters of the president, and gave them that exact message, and they stood up and cheered. They don't see that there's a purpose in the Afghan war or a reason why we're still there. The president agrees. Unfortunately, not everyone advising the president agrees, so it's a little bit of a struggle trying to get what the president says actually into policy. But I think he does believe that. One of the things he said over and over again, I think he truly believes, is that the Iraq war was a geopolitical blunder of epic proportions, and he says that all the time. And I think it does guide him, and I hope it guides him in thinking about whether or not we should be in a new war with Iran, and I think it does.
Yeah, does he understand the relationship between regime change in Iraq and dealing with Iran today?
I think so, and I think if you watch his comments in the last couple of weeks, he's actually mentioned that we're not for regime change in Iran. He said that we're not for regime change because he's got people around him like Bolton who say, "Oh, we're for regime change in North Korea, Iran, you name the country, we're for regime change." When the world will be perfectly peaceful when we hand select all the leaders for all the countries we don't like. That's Bolton, but that's not the president. The president really has a different position. And so I think he doesn't, but at the same time, he doesn't give a pass to Iran either, and there are problems. There are problems really on both sides. As parents say it takes two to fight. War's kind of the same way for the most part. We've been interrupting. The British stopped one of their ships. They've stopped one of the British ships. We've had drones and ships up against their shore. They shot down a drone. But the president, I think, really showed restraint when, after the drone was shot down by Iran, in deciding not to escalate it, not to get into a situation where we dropped several missiles on different military installations and all of a sudden had Iranian deaths. So I think that was probably one of the president's best moments, actually.
So you have been having conversations with President Trump, and he publicly said that he signed off on your communicating with Iranian officials in hopes of averting war. What can you tell us about that, and what can you tell us about what you're trying to accomplish there?
Absolutely nothing. I would have to kill you if I told you. So this is top secret, man. Would it be a secret if I told you?
So this could be the last video that I ever do.
This is your last interview ever.
Yeah.
No, I think I can talk more in general terms about what our goals are with diplomacy and what we should be talking about. I think that the Iranians, as evidenced by the Iran agreement that we had, are willing to limit their nuclear enrichment and really are willing to talk about never having a nuclear weapon. I think they really are in that place, and we could get to a place where I think there could be an agreement. The more difficult aspect, I think, is the ballistic missile agreement. That wasn't part of the Iran agreement, and the president and many people have said that was the big flaw in the agreement. They want a ballistic missile treaty agreement. The problem is you have to understand from Iran's perspective why they develop ballistic missiles. They do because they have regional rivals. Saudi Arabia and Israel basically are armed to the teeth, and Iran sees both of them as rivals, and Iran says, well, that would be like unconditional surrender just to have. It would be like saying we don't want to have an air force and we're not going to have missiles as a deterrent. So I think there is an opportunity, but our side needs to recognize that I think Iran will only negotiate on ballistic missiles if Saudi Arabia came to the table and said, you know what, there's too many weapons all over the Middle East, why don't we all talk about lowering and ratcheting down? That I don't think our side is ready to discuss, and I'm not sure Saudi Arabia is ready to, and Saudi Arabia probably wouldn't without some pressure. And I think part of the mistake we're making now is by continuing, there's no interruption of the arms flow to Saudi Arabia after they killed the dissident Khashoggi. I think had there been, we might have been able to say, you know what, you only get your arms sales, we're only going to continue to help you with your defense and military capabilities if you're willing to sit down at the table with Iran. We could have actually used our leverage on the arms trade to push Saudi Arabia towards it. We still could, but that would be a shift in where our policy is headed. That's the only way I see a ballistic missile treaty ever coming. If our position remains that you have to give up all enrichment, you have to have a ballistic missile treaty, and you have to take bend the knee to great America, there's not ever going to be an agreement. And even though we can defeat Iran in any military battle, I think they will choose simply to wait us out, have skirmishes here and there, and try to defend their pride as a nation. I hope there's another way, but that is one alternative, is that we just lead to more and more conflict with them.
You've been both critical of the original Obama administration Iranian deal with the big upfront payout of money, but also critical of the administration's decision to pull out. Explain that position.
The president, every time you hear him talk, is very, very critical of the money being given up front. And I was critical also for several years as the agreement was coming, in the sense that I think if you had parsed the money out slower over a long period of time, it's your one carrot that you can draw back if there's not compliance. But that being said, all of the international agencies that examine for atomic weapons and enrichment have said that Iran has complied, with the nuclear agreement. The irony is now we pull out of the agreement, and then we're mad because Iran is now enriching above the agreement. It's like, well, we're no longer in the agreement. We sort of breached the agreement. And they also, as we've ratcheted up sanctions, they really do see it as economic warfare, and it would be sort of like telling me, if you're a grocery store owner and you sell groceries and I surround your store and say you can't sell any groceries, you might take offense to that. You might think that I'm acting in an aggressive or warlike manner against your grocery store. That's essentially what we're doing. The old sanctions used to allow quite a bit of oil to go out to China, India, Japan, and South Korea. The new sanctions are trying to squeeze that to zero, and I thought a year or two ago they won't be that effective and Iran will still be able to sell the oil. I think they are being effective, but I think we're going to have the opposite effect. Instead of driving them to negotiation, we may drive them into military confrontation. And so right now, every evidence is the sanctions, as they get worse, are driving us towards more military confrontation instead of saying, oh, well, we're sorry, now we want to talk. So there has to be somehow on our side the ability to understand that we have to give up something. We have to give up some sanctions in order to get some behavior change. That's sort of the carrot we have is relief of sanctions. But if we say we're not giving up any sanctions until they do everything we want, it's sort of an unrealistic ask, and we're never going to get any progress.
What's your broader view on economic sanctions as a foreign policy tool? Because I, for instance, have criticized sanctions on Cuba forever, and yet we still have a Castro regime.
Cuba is a good example of them not working, and it's getting crazier and crazier. There's a whole segment of people up here who believe sanction it. It's sort of like the old, what was the Reagan saying about if it moves, regulate it, if it stops, tax it. The whole idea that there's always an answer through taxation or regulation. It's the same with sanctioning. We have a bill that will be coming up tomorrow in the Foreign Relations Committee, unless we stymie it, which we're going to try to, is that will sanction Europe. It's going to sanction Switzerland. Switzerland's been neutral in 2 world wars. We're going to sanction because they're helping to build the pipeline between Russia and Germany. And I'm in the minority, but I actually think Germany and Russia trading oil and money back and forth is a good thing. I think if Germany's dependent on Russian oil and Russian oil is dependent on German euros, makes them less likely to fight, I would think. I think the trade in general makes you less likely to fight. But there's going to be and it probably will pass, unfortunately, it as sanctions on everybody helping to build the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, but includes Switzerland, Austria, Germany, Holland, Royal Dutch Shell, which has 100,000 workers in America probably.
All of those super belligerent countries.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Holland really needs sanctions. We're having such a tough time with Holland. Yeah. But that's the craziness is they're not blinking an eye. Now, they think they're hurting Russia, but they're actually sanctioning European allies. It's a terrible, awful, rotten, no good bill, and yet we're worried it might pass.
So like in Cuba, the dynamic, and I think this is true in Iran, is that the people in power, the people with political clout do not suffer under economic sanctions, but people get poor and people get hungry.
Right. A good example is to look at Venezuela. Maduro gets fatter and fatter. He probably wears like a size 68 suit by now. I mean, he's enormous. And yet the average person in Venezuela has lost 20 pounds. Not by trying, because of lack of food. They're eating their pets in Venezuela. That's how desperate it is. Yeah. The economic controls, the price controls are devastating and have devastated that economy. I think I saw the other day like 230,000% inflation. I don't even know how that's almost too big to calculate. And yet Maduro gets fatter and fatter. His generals are well fed. And it's been the hard part about getting generals to defect. There's a small amount of food and small amount of money, but it's all going to the president and his cronies. People talk about the top 1% in our country. At least it's somewhat based on merit. The top 1% in Venezuela is based on fidelity to the dictator.
So I started off talking about the chorus of voices clamoring for war with Iran. It's the same voices that have been clamoring for all of these endless wars since 9/11. But they would say that you're being used, that you're being manipulated by the Iranians, and that you'll help them in their propaganda campaign. How do you respond to that?
These are the same group of people who've been misguided since the time of Reagan. They were all criticized Reagan for talking to Gorbachev. I call them diplomatic isolationists. They always want to call people on, the non-intervention side of things. They want to hurl the word isolationist at us, but really they're the ones that want to be diplomatically isolated. I don't accept anything that either Iran, North Korea, or Russia says at face value. I accept it as they're saying it from their point of view and their point of view of their national interest, and that it sometimes probably is deceptive and deceitful. And we do the same thing. We say things in our own national interest. But I'll give you an example of the naivete on the other side. We were in a committee hearing, and one of the Republican senators was arguing, and he says, "I don't care what Tehran thinks." He was arguing for more sanctions, and it's like, I raised my hand and I said, well, if you don't care what they think, I thought you were putting the sanctions on to change their behavior. If you don't know what their behavior is, or at least think what their behavior is and what their opinion is and how they react to the sanctions, then you're not really doing your job here. You know, what are the sanctions supposed to do? Change their behavior.
Hayek might call that a fatal conceit.
Exactly. But that's what we're fighting up here, and it's a very, very small minority of people who get it up here, you know, who really think that either sanctions or war is not the answer. I mean, we got people clamoring for war. I mean, people just blasting the president, saying he should have bombed the crap out of Tehran, you know, that we should just start unleashing thousands of bombs on Tehran, and they have no concern at all for the lives that'll be lost. And not only our lives, thousands of Americans, and we will win a war. We can win any war. So, but, you know, are we willing to send 5,000 American kids to die and kill a couple 100,000 Iranians to show that we are the mightiest and can tell people what to do? And in the end, it'll be worse, because in the end, we'll topple that government, and who knows what replaces it, whether it's better or worse. But the history of the Middle East is we don't tend to find Thomas Jefferson as the next leader. We tend to find someone equally as bad or worse.
So you got to get going. I know you're talking to a lot of people right now, but let's sort of set a baseline. I quoted President Trump, and you've in a lot of ways have endorsed what he calls an America First foreign policy. Give us those principles. Is that a baseline for what the Republican Party should be?
Well, from my perspective, I would say that all foreign policy should be restrained, constitutional, restrained and bounded basically by the rules of the Constitution. And that really foreign policy should be not a geopolitical chess game, although sometimes it is, but it shouldn't be predominantly that. It should be concerned about the individual and the people who have to go. I have 3 nephews who serve in the military, and when I think about whether we should go to war, whether we should send them to Iran, I think, well, that's my nephew. He was at my house last week playing with my kids, and it's like, you know, do I want to send him to war? Is it enough of a value that I'm willing to risk my nephew? And I don't think enough people look at it in a personal way, at least people up here. My dad used to say, yeah, we should have a draft, but the first people that should serve on the very front lines of every war should be the sons and daughters of congressmen and senators, and then maybe we'd have less war.
Yeah. I mean, that feels like an emotional standard, and you know, some progressives have argued that that's why we need to bring the draft back. I don't support that, but Trump has been very clear about the human cost of war.
Yeah, I think so, and I think he gets it, and I think the people are misguided wanting to bring the draft back. It is true that the war is only being fought by a small segment of our public, but it's also a volunteer army. There's something very noble, or makes war less bad to think that people actually are volunteering and do have a choice in what they do. But the military, while there's a choice in joining, once you've joined, there's no choice in speaking out. But I think when you do talk to them, and I talk to a lot of people in the military, we have 2 bases in Kentucky. When I talk to folks in the military, the responses I get back are much more thoughtful about war than you get here in Washington, because they're fighting the war. Some of them have been back 8 and 9 times to Afghanistan. Some of them have teenage children at home and families that they're trying to juggle back and forth. And they're not as excited about going to a war when no general can explain any longer what the purpose of the war in Afghanistan is. There's not a general around that can. We got to stay, because if we leave, you know, they'll take, you know, got to fight them over there, we'll fight them over here, all these platitudes, but none of it makes any sense anymore. And there are so many playgrounds for terrorists to arise in. It's like, oh, if we stay in Afghanistan, there won't be any terrorism. Well, why don't they go to Libya, or why don't they go to Yemen, or why don't they go to any other, you know, misbegotten places that are consumed by war?
Thank you, Senator Paul.
Thank you.
So there it was. I hope you agree with me that Rand Paul is doing yeoman's work trying to get Washington, D.C., the swamp as we call it today, back on track with a less interventionist approach to foreign policy. If you want to know more about this, go to freethepeople.org. We've produced a number of documentaries, most recently State of War, that explain how it is that Congress has abdicated its authority, explain the history of forever war since 9/11 and what you and I can do about it. Please go to freethepeople.org and check out some of this other video content. We got to learn more. We got to get involved. We have to stay engaged. Thank you so much for watching Kibbe on Liberty. Thanks for watching Kibbe on Liberty. By now, you know this is the most important event of your week. So make sure you subscribe on YouTube. Click the little bell so you get notifications. Kibbe on Liberty, mostly honest conversations with mostly interesting people.